Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. We have quite a few students who have joined us. Most importantly, we have our speaker, Professor John Denham from our department. If you haven't already, please mute your microphone. Let's see. All right. Again, welcome everyone. So Professor John Denham will talk about radicalization and counterterrorism policies in the UK based on a report which he has recently been involved in. And we are lucky to have John in particular because he brings expertise from both academic and policy world. He's an active member of our department, but he was an active politician in the past. You can read all about him in his biographical note. I'm not going to give you a prolonged introduction. But we are lucky to have him today. We're lucky to have him in the department too. So John will give you some insights into the report that was recently concluded by an independent commission on UK counter-terrorism law, policy and practice. And then we will hopefully have some time for the discussion too. So John, do you want to talk to us now?
Kamal, thank you very much for the introduction, and very grateful for all the students who've joined us for this webinar. I'm going to talk about a report that was published in the autumn by the Independent Commission on UK Counter-Terrorism Law, Policy and Practice. This was run out of the Bingham Centre for International Law at UCL, University College London, a very prestigious and highly respected institution. You might wonder why produce an independent report on counterterrorism law and practice. Well, it's over 25 years since there was a major single piece of UK terrorism law that set down new definitions of terrorism and whatever. Since then, there have been many changes both to the law and to its application in practice over a hugely wide range of issues, which many people will have heard about, from the prescription of organizations, terrorist organizations, Palestine Action being the one that's been controversial recently, deprivation of citizenship, applying to cases like Shamima Begin, but also raised recently in relation to a British citizen who was able to return here from Egypt, the introduction of new legal procedures, restricted evidence, limited sharing of disclosure with the defense, availability of security service material, and so on. So in other words, there had been a huge change in the environment and the practice of counterterrorism law, and nobody had really had a look at this and say where it's all got to. So the commission that I was honoured to be part of was brought together by the Bingham Centre. It was chaired by Sir Declan Morgan. He is a former head of the Supreme Court in Northern Ireland. It had a wide range of people. So from the political background, I had been a police minister at the time of 9/11 and the Northern Ireland. I was chair of the Home Select Committee, and I was community secretary at the end of the last Labour government. Dominic Grieve was the Attorney General under the Conservative government. Saeeda Vazi was the first Muslim woman to be a member of the cabinet in the Cameron government, but also leading practitioners, former chief constables, people who are active in immigration appeals tribunals, and many other different areas of expertise were brought together. It took 3 years. There were several 2-day plenary sessions, many evidence sessions, not just in this country, but from across Europe and around the world, comparing different systems. What I want to talk about today is a particular area, which is radicalisation and what's known as the prevent strategy in counter-terrorism practice in this country. As you would expect, probably, people who are on the commission tended to focus on one or two areas rather than all of the complex issues we were looking at, and this was one in which I took particular interest, partly because I'd had some involvement with prevent policy in the past, partly because I had been involved in some of the early activities trying to counter the influence of far right extremism. So let's have a look at what we want to look at. Firstly, to set the scene, there's a changing nature of terrorism. The United Kingdom has a long history of terrorist activities going back until the early 1970s in and related to Northern Ireland. And just for context, and I'm not trying to suggest an equivalence, since 2000, around 200 people have died in terrorist incidents in the United Kingdom. That is, each one of those is an appalling death. It is worth remembering that between 1970 and the year 2000, around 200 people a year were killed in terrorist activities. So if you took a long-term view of the level of terrorism in the United Kingdom, you would say it has been significantly less in the last 25 years than it had been in the 20 years before that. But I'm not trying to align the two or say the same. But there has been a changing nature of terrorism over this long period of time. So as the peace process began in Northern Ireland, you then got 9/11 and what followed in the years ahead of what we call Al-Qaeda and ISIS-inspired terrorism. Just quickly on language, we as a commission, we became, the more evidence we had, the more we looked at it, we became more uncomfortable with the widely used term Islamist terrorism. You'll see it referred to in some of the slides because that's still what appears in government reports and documents. But I think we were convinced by the argument that most religions have some terrorism inspired by believers in those religions. There is no other religion which is tagged where terrorism is tagged specifically to the religion. And so we were convinced that the term Islamist is both misleading and offensive and carries implications that we shouldn't use. So just to explain why I called it Al-Qaeda and ISIS inspired, I don't think we think that's a terribly satisfactory term, but it's certainly better than the one that's generically used. So the initial concern in the early 2000s was Al-Qaeda, and then later, 10 years later, ISIS. But we've also had some growth in extreme right-wing terrorism, mainly of the lone actor, the individual acting alone or with very small numbers of other people. We've also had a growth of extreme violence, which is often characterized as mixed, unclear and unstable ideology. In other words, not terrorism that is following the views of a particular group or organization, and indeed which might be confused very much in the minds of the individuals who become involved in violence. More recently, there's been a recognition of the growth of violence fixated people, particularly young people, and this may be an obsession with school shootings or other types of violence, and an understanding within this that a greater proportion of those who are at risk of getting involved in extremist violence are younger, vulnerable, have mental health issues of various sorts. So terrorism has not been a fixed thing over this period of time. Indeed, our understanding of it, the practice of it, has changed quite significantly. The UK counter-terrorism strategy, in brief, is called Contest, and it has 4 elements. Pursue, which is primarily the police and security services trying to track down, disrupt, arrest terrorist plots. Prevent, which I'll talk about today. Protect, which is basically trying to ensure that the infrastructure of the nation is resilient. And prepare, which is to understand that terrorist acts will sometimes occur and we need to be able to respond to them as effectively as possible. There were issues about our preparedness raised, for example, after the Manchester Arena bombings, where there was some considerable criticism of the response of the public services to that event. But I'm going to concentrate today on the prevent strand of this. Prevent essentially has 2 roles in the strategy. It is trying to minimize the number of people who turn to terrorist violence. And at the heart of Prevent is the idea that terrorist violence arises from a radicalization process in individuals, that is a process that can be identified, and if you can identify those in the process of radicalization or at risk of radicalization, you can disrupt the process and therefore minimize the number of people who turn to terrorist violence. And that underlying assumption that you could identify those at risk of radicalization, which has run through the prevent strategy for 20 years now, is what we paid particular attention to. There are really two aspects to prevent. Say a first phase and then a hardcore phase. So prevent in general is usually used to refer to the process by which individuals seen as at risk of radicalization or in the process of radicalization are identified, looked at through a prevent-led process, which is largely police-led, but with other agencies. And those who are recognized at more active risk of radicalization into actual terrorist violence are referred to a more intensive process, of personal mentoring and support called Channel. And I'll come back later to look at those who get drawn into the broader prevent process and those who are referred to Channel for a higher level of engagement, because that is quite important. But let's just look at, for a moment, at radicalization theory. This is something that has developed massively from the early 2000s and the initial response to the 9/11 attacks in New York. And it's come partly because there's been considerable public funding behind it to become a well-established area of research in universities, something that's very much propagated by think tanks, some of which are objective, some of which are less so. There's a number of things we need to recognize about this idea that you can identify the individuals who are at risk of getting involved in terrorist violence. The first is it does very much focus on the individual. The theory of radicalization essentially says this is a process that individuals go through, which leads them to the position where they might consider getting involved in terrorist action or actually committing a terrorist act. The effect of that is actually to draw a distinction between what happens to the individual and the motivation, the underlying motivations they might have for getting involved in an act of terrorist violence. It has the effect, essentially, of diminishing the link with political motivation. So even though, for example, in the mid-2000s, well, actually before the Iraq War, security services warned that taking part in the Iraq War would be likely to lead to an upsurge in terrorist violence. That was set aside, and that was seen as not a legitimate way of looking at the causes of terrorism. What we needed to do was focus on what happened to the individual through that process. So no one was denying there might be a connection, but the issue was you had to tackle what was going to happen to the individual. Now that, just by way of contrast, is completely different to what happened in the 30 years of the Troubles in Northern Ireland and their impact in the wider United Kingdom, where it was never really questioned by anybody that the underlying causes were political. There were different political aspirations. There were disputes about political power and voice and share and representation and citizenship and identity and all the rest of it. And it was always ultimately recognized that if peace were going to be achieved in Northern Ireland, it would require a political resolution to those problems. So it's quite interesting that radicalization theory came in a way which enabled people largely to not have a discussion about the wider political causes that might be there for terrorism. Not saying that anybody was saying there was no link at all, but it shifted the focus to what happens to individuals. The second thing about radicalization theory is that it tended to bundle together all forms of radicalization as part of the problem. But of course, there's actually quite a big difference between holding views that your fellow citizens might regard as extreme, between that and having a view that might legitimate violence by somebody, and between that and the willingness to commit a crime yourself in pursuit of your radical aims. So by bundling all of those up together, you actually confuse what are the boundaries of democratic debate and discussion, which in any free society must include views that most other people find extreme. Otherwise, you're trying to limit unnecessarily the scope of democratic debate. And that much smaller section of people who might actually be willing to uh, go as far as committing terrorist violence or lend support to terrorist violence. So the radicalization theory also has quite a big implication for how we as a society handle people with diametrically opposed views, with extreme views, of views that vary from the mainstream. So there's a potential implication of radicalization theory for democratic debate. And as I'll come back to argue in a moment, actually limiting democratic debate in areas where people hold extreme views can actually become a risk in terms of their likelihood to go on to commit violence, as opposed to something that reduces their risk of becoming involved in violence. A third consequence of radicalization theory is important. And I'll come back to this, but what we know now from the evidence that's gathered over the years is that radicalization is not just about people being at risk of being drawn into terrorist violence. Radicalization also comes from the absence of protective factors, good family relations, a secure job, a sense of being respected and recognized. It can even be the case, as some studies of far right groups have shown, that being in a group with other like-minded people, though many people might find their views offensive, can actually be a protective factor against violence if those groups are organized in what are essentially legitimate and legal activities. Radicalization theory tends to take the practice away from those protective areas which can reduce vulnerability. So if I go on to just quickly give you a bit of history, um, the understanding of radicalization was set out in a series of updates to the overall contest security strategy. So in 2006, the emphasis you can see very clearly there, the aim was to prevent terrorism by tackling the radicalization of individuals. No recognition of the wider context, no recognition of possible political background to particular causes of concern. 2009, it began to become more sophisticated. It recognized that there wasn't a single cause, that there might be political, economic grievances, social or economic exclusion, a sense of not belonging. So a recognition perhaps that this was not a simple staircase. In some of the very early models of radicalization, it was almost suggested, it starts by becoming religious, then it becomes, then you become more seriously religious, then you adopt a so-called conservative theology, and you are on some sort of inevitable staircase that would lead you to terrorism. And that was actually quite strong at the time, even when I was a minister under the new Labour government, this idea that there was a totally predictable path that people might go down. Well, gradually, people began to understand that that wasn't really the way that it worked, but the focus still remained on the individual. And by 2018, Contest was talking about different routes into terrorism. So not simply the routes of terrorism, the conditions for radicalization, some recognition of the absence of protective factors. So while the understanding of the radicalization process was becoming more sophisticated, it still had this essential element. I just move on one more. Yes, 23. began, and this was, I think, both a mixture of AQ and ISIS inspired terrorism and extreme right-wing terrorism, lone actors, where people were radicalized perhaps online or in other ways, which meant there were routes into terrorism where there was no link to the terror group. But even then, the initial thinking lingered strongly in government. In 2019, Parliament had become so concerned about the impact to prevent, particularly on Muslim communities, that it demanded a public inquiry into prevent. One was set up by the government, led by William Shawcross, which came down very heavily to say what we need to be tackling is ideology, the ideas behind terrorism. It was seen in the security establishment, not least, as very much a backward step at the time, but that was the official government policy and was welcomed by Suella Braverman, who, if you've not heard of her, just recently joined the Reform Party at the beginning of this week. So politically within government, there was a contest between what you might call the more sophisticated models of radicalization and the importance of ideology itself. Perhaps significantly, Mark Saban, who was a leading CIA analyst in the early 2000s, looking at the process of radicalization, came to the conclusion, I think, in 2014, that we were no closer to understanding our original question about what leads people to political violence. And that coming from the person who was probably the key architect of radicalization theory was, I think, quite significant. Now, obviously, ideology does play a role. Terrorist groups wouldn't spend so much time refining, promoting their ideology, putting videos out there, getting on social media, and all the rest of it. Crucially, though, ideology does not predict who will commit a terrorist action. And at any one time, there are going to be many more people who hold extremist views than might consider committing violence. And then it becomes more complicated where we have this growth in mixed, unclear, and unstable ideologies, where a view that we heard several times in the inquiry was you get young people who are fixated with violence, they will find an ideology that will justify their desire to commit violence. It is not the ideology that is actually sustaining the violence that they're going to carry out. So radicalization theory, which still lies at the heart of the prevent process, has many different problems. As somebody said, one of our witnesses, society sees extremism as a problem. For some people who become extremists, they see the extreme ideas as a solution to what other problems they've got in their lives. So if I could turn to some of the recommendations the Commission made at this stage, which come from this analysis. The first was that prevent actually needs to find a way of focusing on those who pose a serious risk to public safety, and that trying to draw in all of those whose ideas are extreme, though lawful, will not work in terms of protecting the public from terrorist activity, but also have other undesirable consequences. Not least the stigmatization of those groups, and in this country it's primarily been Muslim communities who believe that they are the primary focus of this activity. Secondly, we said that the radicalization research is really important. We do need to know what happens to people. We do need to understand the trigger points that make somebody vulnerable to violence, but we shouldn't be using radicalization theory to predict who's going to cross that threshold. And thirdly, we said, look, just focusing on the risk factors is not enough. You actually need to say what strengthens the protective factors in individuals, in their families, and their communities, that even if they hold extreme views, makes them much less likely to get involved in violence. So we came out pretty skeptical about the way that radicalization theory had been used as part of the prevent program. And let's remember, this is not an academic discussion. This is actually about trying to keep the public safe. at the root of all of these activities. If you're trying to operate a model that actually doesn't work in its fundamental use of evidence, you're not doing the best job we could do. So that's radicalisation theory. Now, I just want to move on a little bit more in the remaining time I've got, just to talk about a bit more about the history of the practice. Between 2001 and 2009, Prevent had a very strong focus, almost exclusive focus, on Muslim communities. There was, though, pretty substantial engagement from government as a whole in the promotion of resilience and community cohesion as a matter of social policy. This is partly because of the work that I happen to be involved in, going back to 2001, before the 9/11 attacks. There had been a series of riots across northern cities in England. These had taken place between young British men of Pakistani, primarily Kashmiri origin, and white working class young men. And it became very clear from places like Bradford and Oldham that these were communities that had no contact, no knowledge of each other, no understanding of each other, no shared sense of identity. So we had actually developed quite an ambitious program of community cohesion before the 9/11 attacks. One problem at that time, though, was that the two got elided in too many people's minds. And although the initial work that we did on the Northern riots, for example, said nothing about Islam or Muslim communities, made no claims that it was Muslim communities rather than white communities that were separating that were keeping people apart. That became part of the government, including, sadly, some of my colleagues in government. But so around about 2009, when I was the Secretary of State and responsible for this, we shifted the focus away from an exclusive focus on Muslim communities, and we maintained some of the cohesion work, and we started doing work at trying to undercut the support of far right groups, which at that time was the British National Party. Between the end of the Labour government, 2009 through to 2011, the new Conservative government, Prevent was expanded to include extreme right-wing terrorism. There was a separation of counter-terrorism work from cohesion strategies, which in principle was not a bad thing. In practice, because this was a time of austerity, it meant that the funding of cohesion strategies dramatically reduced in most places across the country, leaving the only funding stream that was available in many places being the money for Prevent. The Prevent strategy also began to concern itself with extremism as a phenomenon in its own right. I was quite amused to find that in 2023, being left-wing, not being extremely left-wing, but being left-wing was put in the Prevent strategy as a cause for concern and potential risk of cohesion. So the biggest change, and one that's had a big impact on the number of people involved, was in 2015. There was great concern about the large numbers, or relatively large numbers, of young people who went to Syria to join ISIS or Daesh, and a concern that they had not been picked up earlier, that there hadn't been interventions that took place earlier. And that was when the Prevent duty was introduced, which required, over 1 million public service workers, including Cameron and myself, and many nurses, many teachers, all university academics, doctors, social workers, and others, to report concerns about radicalisation from those that they were working with. There is no other advanced country which has tried to involve such a large sector of its public service workers in monitoring the views and activities of such a large section of the population. That is probably the most significant single development in the Prevent strategy. Now, if we remember that this is based on a radicalisation theory which turns out to be flawed, you can see some of the emergent problems that are likely come up here. Cameron may have his own views. I would side with those that we had witnesses who said the quality of training provided to public service workers on what you're looking for, if you're looking for signs of radicalisation, is particularly poor. And it leads the danger that public service workers bring in their own possibly prejudices or maybe simple misinformation about what they might be looking for into the process of identifying who is at risk. And I look quickly at some of the figures. Prior to 2015, the prevent duty, a few hundred people a year might get referred to prevent. You can see that after 2015, you're talking 7,000 people a year referred into the system. Probably 7 times as many have been alerted or identified at an earlier stage in the process, where a university lecturer might discuss a particular student with a prevent lead within the university or something of that sort. So this is almost the tip of the iceberg of the people who enter the system. What you see there, if you look at the last column, is that the proportion of those who are identified as possibly at real risk of becoming involved in violence activity is much smaller, typically 9% of all of those cases. So from the very large numbers of people who might be discussed as a potential matter of concern, to those who enter the first stage of the prevent program, to those who go into the channel, there's a very sharp fall indeed. You can also see the effect of the prevent duty, meaning that it is the largest single category of people who get referred into prevent are aged between 11 and 17. That's a very young age for people to be formally put into a process that suggests they might be at risk of radicalisation. And there have been many cases, I mean, there are a small minority, of course, but of sort of ludicrous referrals into the system. For example, a parent raising concerns about a mixed space changing room at school was actually discussed as a potential prevent referral. There have been cases of a school child wearing a Palestinian badge, things of that sort. Now, that's not what most of these referrals are, but these become very damaging indeed. And it's easy to see why, particularly in Muslim communities, prevent can be seen as something which runs the risk of stigmatizing their young people for holding views that would be regarded as quite normal or mainstream within the community. And these are, by the way, the channel cases there, but it's very similar for others. Just to go back. The other thing that is also quite interesting, though, is the change in the nature of the referrals. Back in 2016, 2017, post ISIS and Daesh, the largest single category were those that the government defined as Islamist terrorism. There's been a general increase in that has fallen off as a proportion of referrals. There's been a consistent strand of extreme right-wing terrorism, but also this big growth to well over half now of those with these mixed, unclear and unstable references. So the caseload coming into prevent has changed significantly. Okay, so let me just pick up some of the issues that arise out of what I call the fault lines in prevent. The first that I've mentioned is that from the beginning, prevent was seen as something that stigmatized Muslim communities. This does not mean that Muslim communities did not want to participate in activities that kept their young people safe. They did. But terms like Islamist terrorism, the initial focus exclusively on Muslim communities, the sort of issues that have people being referred to have raised big concerns in Muslim communities. Secondly, prevent has not responded well to the changing nature of the terrorist threat and other forms of violence. Thirdly, the boundaries between prevent and other areas of concern about young people have become unclear. Indeed, a significant proportion of young people who end up in the prevent program, and indeed quite a lot who end up in channel, are quickly identified as having other needs, unmet mental health needs, family breakdown, engagement in crime, issues of that sort that really need to be dealt with by other agencies. But as funding for other activities has been cut back, Prevent has become almost the only place where people can refer young people for some sort of assistance. So the boundaries between counter-terrorism activity and other forms of concern about young people have become blurred. There has consistently been poor coordination between police, counter-terrorism, and other local agencies. We have very poor data and evaluation, so we have been processing very large numbers of people through Prevent and through Channel. There's very little independently available, robust evaluation of whether or how much any of this works. That, incidentally, is not a particular UK problem. We found this was the case in many other countries that do some sort of counter-radicalisation work. And you could say that this culminated, in a sense, tragically in the Southport murders committed by a young man who had been referred to Prevent 3 times. He clearly was fixated with violence, but he did not get into the Prevent program or the Channel program because he was seen as not having an ideology which meant that he was trying to pursue some sort of terrorist ideology. And there were tragic consequences of that, the murders of the girls, but it led, of course, to widespread social disorder. One person was jailed for calling on social media for the burning down of asylum hotels, which then led J.D. Vance to make his infamous speech to the Munich Security Conference, talking about the loss of free speech in countries like the United Kingdom. Well, I won't go into the details of that. The Southport case is somewhat more complex than I've made it talk. Some people who reviewed it said, well, the people on the ground made the wrong decision. But it rather illustrates the way in which Prevent was the only place where somebody like the murderer could have been referred to, but his problems were not those for which Prevent was originally designed. So I'm going to actually, because I've gone on for quite a long time, Kamal, I will leave it there. I was going to say that if you have a look at the report, actually, no, I'm just going to leap forward to, wait a minute, I'm going to just go to some of our recommendations, cut that one out, go for some other recommendations. So with those critiques I've made of Prevent, what are the things that we need to do in the future? Well, firstly, we need to focus on how we build up the resilience of individuals and communities, not focus simply on risk and vulnerability. We need to broaden safeguarding because there is this larger group of young people who are at risk of violence to themselves or to other people. We need to keep Prevention Channel, but only for those where the terrorist threat is real. And that led quickly to the main recommendations, which have also been repeated by the independent reviewer on terrorism, that what we actually need is a much better local authority, multi-agency safeguarding approach at local level. There have been examples of good practice where Prevent has been changed effectively by getting all the different local agencies, social services, youth services where they still exist, policing, health together, to have what is generally referred to now as a big front door, where all young people who are seen as vulnerable one way or another are referred, and from which those who may have a particular terrorist risk can go to a focused Prevent and Channel, but others can be dealt with in other ways. And there was what we regarded as a highly successful pilot called Dovetail, which did this in a number of areas of the country, which we think should be the model for the future. We think that when you have a broader safeguarding role, then really the bit of safeguarding that is referring to people to prevent no longer needs to be underpinned by a legal duty and simply becomes all of those in a position of responsibility should exercise for those for whom they're responsible, whatever the particular cause of the problem. So shift the concern away from trying to identify who might be radicalized in a terrorist direction to those who are vulnerable. And this would mean bringing into the system the excellent work that exists in some parts of the country, but not other, about violence reduction and the techniques that have been used around knife crime and other crimes where there's demonstrable ability to show progress and effectiveness. I'm going to stop it there, Carol, because I said to you before, I've not done this presentation before, and it's gone on slightly longer than I had in mind. There is more in this area about countering extremism and about community cohesion, but for the sake of the students and for the chance to have some discussion, I'll leave it at that point. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much. This has been so interesting, and I haven't read the full report myself. So I'll just ask you one question, playing perhaps a little bit of a devil's advocate, as I typically like to do, asking a question perhaps from the perspective of someone who might be more kind of center right or right kind of wing minded. When you talk about the fault lines in Prevent, you said you listed Muslim stigmatization as the kind of primary point. Does this point come from the place where we don't want to be seen as racist and decide that it is inappropriate to single out any particular religion or ethnic group? Or does it come from an empirical observation where it is observed that neither Islamic religion nor any particular cultural characteristic of the Muslim community are standing out for the purposes of preventing radicalization?
Okay, so that's a very good question because there's quite a lot in there that you put. So firstly, it is, yes, I think that it is a mistake, an empirical mistake, to believe that there is a particular association between Islam and a religion and terrorist activity by Muslims, by which is not to say there are not Muslims who use their faith to justify their terrorist activity. But Anders Breivik, who killed all the Norwegian young socialists, was a Christian. The man who committed the attack on the mosque in Christchurch in New Zealand was a Christian. But we don't, and going way back, was it the Oklahoma or Utah bombings in America were carried out by Christians. We don't talk about Christian terrorism. There are clearly acts around the world carried out by Buddhists, by Hindus. Most faith groups have got a section that will carry out terrorist activities in the name of their religion. The difficulty we've got with the Muslim community and language like Islamic terrorism is the assumption that there's something inherent in the religion which is particularly open to terrorism, and I think that's the second problem. That's the first problem. The second problem is in terms of broader characteristics. Well, again, I think it's a dangerous stigmatization. So there's undoubtedly, for example, a cultural conservatism, not in all of the Muslim communities in this country, but in some of them. But there's actually cultural conservatism amongst white working class communities from where some right-wing extremists come from. But we tend not to regard the white working class as inherently terrorist, right? Or to treat them as though their major problem that they present to us is far-right extremism or far-right violence. And actually what we've the evidence in the past, including my own work on a program called Connecting Communities, was that it is not difficult to undermine the basis of far-right politics in white communities by addressing other issues of concern. And I would say it is demonstrably the case in Muslim communities that those issues of concern can be addressed in other ways. So yeah, I think, but the other aspect of Muslim stigmatization, I think, is that if you isolate a community and as it were inherently or particularly vulnerable, you are probably increasing the level of risk that as a society you face. That if you say to people your views are unacceptable They're not within the normal discourse of discussion. Most people will probably be a bit annoyed about that, but not do anything about it. But the danger is that others see this as proof that they're excluded from the wider debate. So in the slides that I didn't have to get onto, we're dealing with the need for a social cohesion strategy. One of the things that needs to be done upstream of all this work we've been talking about today is the sort of social cohesion strategy that can create the space for people to have difficult conversations between people with views that are diametrically opposed, to include people whose views are extreme though legal, so that people don't feel excluded from the normal democratic debate. So I think stigmatization of communities actually makes that more difficult, not not easier, and creates actually a real risk that a minority will take that exclusion as a justification for more extreme action.
Thank you so much, John. That's very helpful and very illuminating. Niame Ayek is asking, how do we measure whether the UK's counter radicalization strategies such as prevent are effective? So, do we have any metrics to? It's easy to say when something was ineffective, right? We see it in the news. How do we measure the effectiveness?
Well, the truth is the report's got quite a lot of information about the lack of data. We don't have, I mean, it's inherently difficult to measure, but it's quite difficult, even on channel, which is where people are likely to be referred because perhaps they have been looking at terrorist websites, that sort of stuff. So, you know, they're a bit more adjacent than just having an extreme view about some political view. We don't really know how effective those interventions are. We were reasonably convinced, and I'm afraid this is not as scientific as a student would like, that those who are involved in channel, that it does have some diversionary effect, that people do go through the channel process, they don't get involved in further offending. But it's quite hard to tell, isn't it, what is definite and what's not happened. And even when it goes the other way around, in one of, I forget the time period. In one period, there were about 40 people were convicted, I think, of terrorist activities, a quarter of whom had been through the Prevent program. But it's a moot point. Does that mean the Prevent program failed, or that, in fact, that happened at a particular point in somebody's life, and the actual radicalizing moment that got them into violence happened later and beyond the Prevent program? I think we would just say that we have drawn hundreds, potentially hundreds of thousands of people, and certainly tens of thousands of people into a process which does not have a firm evaluation.
There is a related question about the Southport attacks. Like when there are warning signs, when there are reports that a particular individual might be a risk, like and like how does it then happen that it's not taken sufficiently seriously, or is it a misrepresentation of the situation?
Okay, so Southport is complex, and I think we're still waiting for the detailed report. But broadly speaking, the people operating the Prevent system in Southport believed that to go into the Prevent program and then into Channel, there needed to be an ideological motivation for this person's interest in violence. The Southport murderer did not show an ideological interest. He wasn't a supporter of Al Qaeda or Daesh or anything else. He was just fixated with violence. And they made the decision, therefore, to exclude him from the program. Now, that was probably a misjudgment, but nonetheless, it came from, you saw the Shawcross report, it came from the way people understood their role. What undoubtedly did not exist in Southport was a really effective multi-agency organisation to which young people, and maybe some older people, who are seen as a threat to themselves and others could be referred. So that whatever their problem was, whether it was a mental health issue, whether it was social isolation, whether it's family breakdown, whatever it might be, could be dealt with by the most appropriate agency. And in some places, what Prevent has become is a place where people, we were told this by practitioners, they will refer a young person with a severe mental health problem because they might get it treated in Prevent, and it might take 2 years to get them treated through the child and adolescent mental health services.
Yeah.
So Prevent has become, in some places, a far too broad thing that's gone a long way away from terrorism. And in the Southport case, actually people interpreted their responsibilities so narrowly that he never got the support or intervention he might have had.
Thank you. There is a kind of slightly broader political question. From Charlotte, the political discourse in Western Europe has changed over the last couple of years, largely influenced by the direction taken by Trump and Republican Party. Previously, extreme attitudes have been normalized, especially towards minorities and immigrants. What consequences do you think this has for radicalization, particularly in combination with COVID-19? I think the question is about whether you had a chance to reflect on the possible impact of the new direction the Republican Party has been taking under Donald Trump towards the kind of radicalization and the kind of extreme attitudes, perhaps in the American society, but those attitudes will often travel to the UK in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think two things. Because COVID was also mentioned in the question. I mean, there has undoubtedly been a sharp increase in the number of young people displaying what, in broad terms, might be called worrying behaviours. And there is not at the moment the sort of big front door, the broad local agency joined up response from all the different public services to meet the needs of those young people. So that's the first part of it. We need to have that in place rather than an extension narrowly of counter-terrorism activity, because they're displaying all sorts of risks and vulnerabilities that we're not meeting well. It obviously then happens that if people have vulnerabilities, mental health issues, or what it might be, the broader environment is something that some people are going to pick up on. So I don't know of any evidence that any's been able to track something over the last 2 years, but the fact that something like X now is promotes openly racist, white supremacist material, it would be surprising if there was no audience for that amongst young people. That might be that there are young people who, for all sorts of reasons, have a fixation with violence, who then seize on some of their rhetoric as a justification for their interest in violence. Others might pursue it in a more ideological way. But undoubtedly, the broader political discourse is likely to feed into this. But that's why we shouldn't really just say, well, how do we deal with the terrorist bit of it? We actually need to see this as a problem, particularly of young people, but some other older vulnerable people as well.
Thank you, John. Are you aware of any policy changes following the failure to intervene in the Southport attack? That's what Barbara is asking.
Not yet, but we and the independent reviewer of Prevent have made very similar recommendations about this multi-agency approach at local level. So that's not yet something that has been adopted by government. It's something that some of us will continue to lobby on over the year or so ahead. But I think that it's quite interesting that people looking at the evidence from different angles have come to a similar conclusion about what needs to be done. So we'll have to see what happens.
Thank you so much, John. Well, thank you. We are well on time. Thank you so much. That it's been very, very, very interesting. I learned a lot, and I hope students did too. Thank you also for answering the questions. Very, very helpful. Well, thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you very much.
And I'm looking forward to organizing more of those events. I'm encouraged by the attendance, so I really look forward to future events. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.